Because I believed God wanted me to take that experience. Some of it was very hard, especially in the public school. It was tough, but it was excellent understanding. And I took that in order to develop programs for teachers to go back to school and get their degree, but get it from a biblical worldview and an understanding of special education, the way it would work in a Christian school.
Welcome to the BJU Press Teacher Edition podcast, where Christian educators are encouraged and inspired as we bring you interviews, practical ideas, strategies, and answer your questions about teaching in today's culture. And here's your host, Jenny Copeland.
Welcome back. We are so glad you're tuning in. Lisa Joyner is here again, and we're going to pick up our discussion about special education in Christian schools. Lisa gave us so much to think about in part one as we talked about a strong definition of special education, a broad look at how Christian schools can support those students, and even about the impact of struggling students in the traditional classroom. Listeners, if you missed part one, you really missed some great insights from Lisa, so you need to be sure to go back and listen to those. Lisa, thank you again for your time and your insights. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun talking to you about some of the basics of special education, and I'm always excited to share my passion with other Christian schools, knowing that there are a lot of teachers out there that recognize the need, because many of those students, this is not just a matter of enrolling new students who have special needs. This is about helping the ones who are already there,
right?
Who have some disabilities or just some weaknesses, and so learning how to support them, it's important.
Yeah. So true. So in part one, I mentioned that sometimes teachers can just tell something isn't right. At other times, after getting to know the student and the level of effort they're putting forth, it's pretty obvious there's some genuine struggle there that's significant. So Lisa, I wondered if we could start off part two with just some practical insights as to how Christian schools can really identify and support those students who are struggling. We talked a little bit about it in part one, but take us back. Where do they start? What can we do first?
Well, I think it depends on whether this is a new student coming in or whether it's an existing student. And last week, we talked a lot about the existing student and going back to the cumulative folders and looking at prior testing and doing the investigation with parents and getting their input, looking at earlier report cards, and again, the assessments, doing some benchmark assessments and then progress monitoring. For instance, if you are a third grade teacher and you do benchmark testing at the beginning of the year for reading and reading levels, and then you continue to work with you might see that there is a weakness, and then you continue to work with them throughout the year, perhaps in small groups, and then you do some progress monitoring, which means you come back and you continue to do additional reading assessments. If you see no growth, then that's a flag right there. Yeah. They're not making any growth. If they are making growth, well, then you just continue to do what you are doing. By the way, that will make you a hero to parents, because instead of just saying, well, your child is making a C in reading, what does that even mean? What is a C in reading when you're in the third grade? Okay.
Right.
It's very subjective, unfortunately. Whereas an assessment, a good quality reading assessment that just does not take that long by a teacher to do, maybe 15 minutes at a time, that will give you some real data. You can see, oh, well, this child who's in the third grade, 5th month, should be at a 3.5 grading level, but is reading at a 2.9. That's actual data. Right. And then if you meet with the parent, a parent-teacher meeting in November, and you've already shown them that they started out with you at a 2.9, well, then when they are at a 3.1, you've got actual progress to show them. So that's real important. And just, again, looking back at those folders, and being aware, that's how you identify the students that you already have.
That's great.
The students who are coming to you from the public school, identifying them should not be as difficult, especially if they came with an IEP from a public school. That's a flag right away. That's already a valuable information. Unfortunately, many schools weaponize that against that child. Like, oh, you have an IEP? Sorry, we can't accept you. That's why it's not right, but it's why many parents, I've seen this happen, they aren't upfront with that. They are afraid to disclose to the Christian school that they're trying to enroll their child in. They're afraid to disclose that their child has a diagnosis or has an IEP. I think Christian schools should consider the benefits, and there are huge benefits to accepting students who have disabilities. Number one, many times those kids have siblings and they come together. And so, it helps your enrollment. Not to think that everything is financial, but it certainly helps. And
Sure.
so they have siblings that come in. But another huge benefit is for the rest of the student body. And I've seen this in programs that I had been a part of, and my own children who were a part of the school where I started this program for special needs. My kids weren't in that program. They were in general ed classrooms, but they had the privilege of growing up around kids who had special needs of all sorts. They had kids in their classes who had learning disabilities. Some had, would be considered slow learners, but they also interacted with those kids who were at the tier 3, where we talked about tier 3 last time.
Right.
They were the ones in the separate setting, students who had Down syndrome or autism. Many kids growing up in our Christian schools don't have access to these students. They don't grow up around them. They grow up in a little bubble where everybody looks at just like them and has the same abilities that they do. Whereas my kids grew up completely surrounded, and so it's completely normal to them. And I think that has really enriched them, as I have seen it enrich all of the students in the student body. Because, we live in a cursed earth. The world is cursed, and we're seeing more of everything. More cancer, more disabilities, more ADHD, more of all the things. More sin. It's a curse. So, yes, there are more disabilities now than what there have been, and there are going to be more in the future. So therefore, these students that graduate from our schools, the likelihood of them having children who have disabilities is very high.
True.
Do we want that to be their very first exposure? Imagine the fear of that. If you have always lived in this safe little bubble where everybody was like you, and you've never spent any time around a child who has Down syndrome, and now you have one, the fear is extraordinary. But instead, if you grew up with someone who has Down syndrome, then it's not so unusual. It's not so scary. And
Sure.
I think it just really broadens and it's always a good thing to include every member of the body of Christ.
Yeah.
Every single member.
Right. So most teachers have a bag of tricks, we could say, to help when they identify a student who's not understanding or maybe not picking up on something. They have those scaffolding techniques, the multimodal strategies and such. But when a student is genuinely struggling across the board, so often those strategies are not sufficient to support the student. Some teachers are proactive, and they're going to go out and they're going to seek ways to try to help that student. But all in all, most general classroom teachers are not credentialed, or honestly, they just don't even feel comfortable supporting struggling students or significant struggles. Talk to us about that scenario, Lisa. You have formal training, but what about the rest? Do you feel that teachers, do they really need a special ed degree in order to teach students with special needs? What's your thought on that?
Well, best case scenario is yes. And that's what I wanted to do. And that was the path that God led me toward. And I was in a place where I could. And it has served me and my students very well to go on and get training. It's why I do what I do now after spending 10 years in the general ed classroom and then 10 years in special education in a Christian school. And then that year in Egypt, I call that my year in Egypt when I taught in the public school. So all of that teaching combined, I took that because I believed God wanted me to take that experience. Some of it was very hard, especially in the public school. It was tough, but it was excellent understanding. And I took that to Veritas Baptist College, where I am now, in order to develop programs for teachers to go back to school and get their degree, but get it from a biblical worldview and an understanding of special education the way it would work in a Christian school.
Sure.
I wasn't able to do that. My education, my degrees in special education, my master's in special education was very tailored towards the public school. And I felt that it was weak in instructional strategies and methods of instruction. It was really tailored towards writing the perfect IEP. And buddy, I
Wow.
can write a beautiful IEP that, will pass the state audits and so on. So that, but that's very important, because if any jot or tittle is incorrect on those, the school
True.
can be charged thousands of dollars. So it was important that I learned how to do that. But when I helped develop this one for Veritas, I knew it was important that we included those things, of course, but that we made it heavier on the instructional strategies, the
Right.
how-tos. But I also recognize not everybody can do that. So one of the things that we are working on right now and hope to roll out in the next few months, or at least by the fall of 2024, the goal is, and that is a special education certificate, where we are gathering some of our instructors, those that we know, and then others that are credentialed in special education and have experience in Christian schools working with kids with special needs. So they understand where you are as a Christian school teacher. They understand the resources that you have available to you or not available to you. And what we're doing is developing 30 topics, overview topics of basically what you need to know if you're going to adequately serve kids in your school that have special needs. And because even if there's just one person in the building who is somewhat of an expert, and they don't have to be an expert on everything, but they're kind of the expert on this, they can serve as a consultant for the rest of the school. They can be the one that the administrator can go to with a folder and says, we've had this family to apply. Can you look at this folder and let us know? Does this look like a good fit for us or not? And because one thing I don't want I don't want to leave anybody here with the impression that, or guilt anyone into thinking you have to accept every single student that requests enrollment. That's not what I'm saying here. I'm saying open your eyes to being willing to, and then looking to see, and being more open to accepting students who have disabilities, and increasing your skills so that you can. But I also understand that it's not going to be possible for every single student. When that happens, I don't want to, if I get too far off here, just bring me back, Jenny, okay? But there are going to be those students sometimes that it's not a good fit, okay?
Right.
And
Absolutely.
Usually that is going to be a behavior thing. But the way to know, and I've read through these folders before and like, oh, I have some questions. And so, by reading through those, the notes of former teachers and so on, and if there's some diagnoses I see that I get a little concerned. If I see ODD, that means oppositional defiance disorder. That concerns me. And so if I have a concern, then I'll ask the parents to have the child shadow for a couple days in our classroom. And they can't hide everything from me in 2 days, because there's some that I call them runners. If this kid was a runner, it's not safe. We can't.
Right.
There have been some kids in elementary too, and that's what really breaks me when we've had to let go of some elementary students. But there was one in kindergarten, and I'm telling you, we were a wreck when we had to tell him because it was awful. This child was adopted by a sweet family that had rescued this child from a terrible situation. And we were, honestly, I think their last hope for somewhere to put him. But we just couldn't keep him. He was literally throwing desks. He was dangerous. And the rest of the class was afraid. The teacher was afraid. Okay, because there is a difference between an academic disability
Correct.
and a mental illness.
Right.
And there are some psychological disabilities that no, you are not equipped for. And and when that happens, then it's really tough. And I used to look for somewhere else. I would do everything I could to try to help them come up with another plan. I don't think we should just say, oops, sorry, hope that works out for you.
Right.
We need to try to do something. But then I think you asked me, let's go back to what if you don't have the degree? And then I suggested this program that we've got for the certificate. But the other would be become an expert on that particular disability that that child has. If you know that you're getting a child in your classroom who has autism, become an expert on autism. It's not hard to do. There are books, there are websites. Autismspeaks.org is one of the best websites that's out there. Tons of information. And search, and you said, as you said, there are some teachers that are really willing to dig in. And honestly, Jenny, those teachers are listening to your podcast, because the teachers that aren't willing to dig in, they're not listening to Educator Comp podcasts.
That's true.
They're not going to waste their time. They're just going to keep doing everything the way they've been doing it. And unfortunately, that's not very effective. But when you're listening to podcasts like this, you're willing to sharpen your tools. And so become an expert on those particular disabilities in your classroom. And the parents will really appreciate that about you.
Absolutely.
When you say, look, I've been reading and I have found this. And then ask them, what do you know that works best for your child? They're the expert on their child. Ask them. Just be willing to think outside the middle of the road. Be willing to look for something different. And I'm probably really, I hope I don't alienate any of your listeners here by telling you that I embrace artificial intelligence. I love it, okay? Because AI, when used correctly, will just transform the way that you can plan instructional strategies and assessments in your classroom. I'm a fan of Google Brisk for teaching. It's a free extension that you can put on your Google account. It'll write rubrics. It'll suggest ideas. You just give it a good prompt and say, hey, I'm a fourth grade teacher. Could you suggest some instructional strategies for a lesson on Abraham Lincoln? And then how about some authentic assessments? Oh, I like that one. Give me the details for that and write a rubric. It'll do it all. It's pretty incredible. You can take it to a website. You can go online to a website on Abraham Lincoln, click the Google Brisk there and say, turn that into a presentation. So I have found some really interesting instructional strategies just by using some artificial intelligence.
Yeah, there are tools out there. And I'm so glad of how you approach that of, no, you don't have to drop everything and go get a doctorate, but you do need to be trained. You do need to know we say so often on this podcast, our students deserve our best. And we would not be okay with a dentist, working on our heart just because they're a doctor. And often as educators, we think, well, we tend to go one way or the other. There's nothing we can do. I don't know what to do to help you. And so you're out of here. Or we just try to treat with what we know instead of going and learning about and digging in so we can help that student. Okay, so moving along, when a student applies at a Christian school and special needs are identified in the school and the parents have some decisions to make as to whether or not that student is a good fit for the school, without compromising their mission or really who they are as a school, and of course without misleading families as to what they can really offer for that child, how can a Christian school become more hospitable for that student with special needs? And I'm actually going to combine it with a secondary question is, how can we really advocate for these families being in Christian schools? And we'll wrap up with those questions.
Okay. First, I love that you brought up the mission statement. Go back to the mission statement.
Yeah.
What does it say? Because if you are a private school and there are several around here in this area where I am in Raleigh, North Carolina. There's some very expensive, elite private schools. And you have to be academically elite to enter these private schools. Their goal is that they will train these little elitists to go out and be politicians and doctors and lawyers and engineers and do great things. And that's fabulous. They are not prone to, they don't accept students who don't pass their, you know what, they can do that because that's their mission statement. Their mission statement says that's what they're going to do. They take these academically elite and they train them. Christian school mission statements don't say that, and yet sometimes they operate like that is their mission statement. But they don't. They say, we're here to, they expand the kingdom of God. You've read these, they expand and train them, heart, mind, soul, and, and show God's love. all the things. Oh, but that doesn't include students who have special needs. So I'm like, go back to your mission statement, because if you're going to turn down a child just because he has a learning disability that could be easily accommodated in the classroom, go back to your mission statement and maybe you need to reword it. I'm not trying to be harsh, but that is how we advocate. You ask me how we advocate? I'm advocating. I'm advocating for these students who deserve to have that Christian school education too, if that's what their parents want for them, if they want a biblical worldview for them. Let me give you an example. Take a drink here a second. I'm not going to tell you which state I was in, but I'll tell you that I was at a conference one time. And at this conference, I was going to be speaking on the topic of learning disabilities and making the case for why schools should include students with learning disabilities. And I always have to start out, unfortunately, but I always have to start out with the justification for why Christian schools should, which for me just seems like such an enormous waste of time when it should, like, come on, we're Christians. Can you see Jesus saying, oh, no, sorry, you're not academically sound enough. You can't look at the 12 he surrounded himself with. These were not elite. Okay. But anyway, I always have to begin with that. The room was very full. It was, I would say, probably 100, 125 people in this building, or in this room that I was going to be speaking in. And the time had come to start, and the doors had closed. And there was a door close to me, and then there was a door way far in the back, and everybody was still speaking. We're still just chatting. And I heard someone knocking at the door where I was. It was a latecomer. So I thought, I got time. So I walked away from my podium, and I walked over there, and I opened the door, and I recognized this young man. I knew him. I hadn't seen him in years, but I knew him, and he recognized me. And we're like, oh my goodness, it's so great to see you. How are you doing? How's your mom? I'm like, what are you doing here? And he said, I am a music teacher at so-and-so Christian school. I went, good for you. Fantastic. I'm glad you're here. He had a seat. And I had a moment, because I'm like, I've got to speak right now. And I so want to use him as an example, but I can't. Yeah. But here's the example. I knew that this young man, and at this point he was in his mid-20s, but I knew that when he was middle school, going into high school, maybe it was 9th grade, that he applied to go to a Christian school that was associated with the church where he and his mom went. His mom was a single mom because his father had died, and so she was raising him. He had ADHD, and he went to a public school. The Christian school turned him aside because he had ADHD, and he had a learning disability. Good kid, really, really good kid. And then years went by. I was not part of that decision. I knew about it. But here, years later, same young man, and he shows up at a teachers' convention for Christian school educators, and he is teaching Christian music in a Christian school. And I thought, good for you.
Yeah,
good for you,
that's incredible.
Buddy. But what a missed opportunity for that Christian school to have been able to pour into him. But he was able to do it anyway with the public school education. But he was an example of a mom who just wanted her son to be raised with a biblical worldview in a Christian school, but had not been allowed that opportunity.
Yeah. So much to keep before us. And no, we may not be able to do it tomorrow, but do we have a vision for how we can help them? Do we have a plan so that we can offer that education and that caring, loving, biblically integrated environment for students?
Right.
Lisa, once again, you always have so much to bring to the table. I feel like we could talk and just go episode to episode. This has been great. Thank you for sharing from your experience and your expertise. And thank you for what you do every day for Christian education. I know you don't stop. You go, go, go. I know I've personally learned so much from you. And I know today that our listeners are walking away with just so much practical advice again from what you shared. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Jenny. It was a privilege and nice to learn from you as well.
Listeners, thank you for joining us today as well. I hope you were encouraged and challenged. Remember to go to teachereditionpodcast.com to submit questions for our upcoming episodes. Of course, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Now, it's time to get back to your day. But again, it's not just any day, because every day in the classroom is your day to impact and inspire through God's power and through His grace working in you. Now go do what God has called you to do.